Have you noticed something interesting lately, Sussex Gang? The conversation around Prince Harry has changed, but not in the way most people think. For years, we were told Harry was bitter, angry, stuck in the past, and incapable of moving on. Every interview he gave, every documentary he participated in, every chapter of Spare was dismissed as another complaint. The headlines weren't interested in understanding him. They were interested in portraying him as the problem. But now something remarkable is happening. The media isn't actually asking why the rift exists anymore. It's trying to make the public forget why it exists. And that, to me, is one of the biggest narrative shifts we've seen since Harry and Meghan stepped away from royal life. Think about it. When Harry recently returned to the UK, what should have been a discussion about the purpose of his visit quickly morphed into another familiar debate. Will the brothers ever reconcile? What will their relationship look like in 10 years? Is there still hope for peace? Those questions sound harmless on the surface. In fact, they sound compassionate. But listen carefully to what they're doing. They're moving the conversation away from cause and toward consequence. They're asking us to focus on the broken relationship instead of asking what broke it in the first place. That's a subtle but incredibly powerful shift. Because once you stop asking why something happened and start asking why it hasn't been fixed, you've already rewritten the story. Suddenly, accountability disappears. Responsibility becomes blurred. The original issues become background noise. And before you know it, people begin talking as though this family simply drifted apart because life got complicated. But that's not the story Harry has told. Whether you agree with every word in Spare or not, nobody can honestly say Harry has been vague about why he left. He has spoken extensively about the pressures of royal life, the relationship with the press, the lack of institutional support, and the deeply personal conflicts within his own family. Those explanations have been available for years. You don't have to accept every claim to acknowledge that they exist. Yet increasingly, some commentators behave as though those explanations were never given. Instead, they speak about the rift as though it descended from the sky one random afternoon. And that's where I think we need to slow down. Because history isn't always rewritten by telling outright lies. Sometimes history is rewritten simply by changing the question. Instead of asking, what happened? People begin asking, why can't Harry let it go? Instead of asking, what caused trust to collapse? The conversation becomes, why won't they just make up? Do you see the difference? One question seeks understanding. The other quietly shifts responsibility. That is why I find this latest wave of commentary so fascinating. It's almost as if we're being encouraged to skip over the uncomfortable chapters and jump straight to the happy ending. But reconciliation without accountability isn't reconciliation at all. It's simply asking one side to carry on as though nothing happened. Now, let's be clear about something, because this is important. Families argue, siblings fall out. No one is pretending disagreements don't happen. But this stopped being an ordinary family disagreement the moment it became a global public story. Harry didn't just leave his family. He left an institution that has shaped British public life for generations. The monarchy isn't simply a family business. It is one of the world's most scrutinized public institutions. That means questions about transparency, public accountability, and media narratives naturally become part of the discussion. And that's exactly why this story continues to matter. Notice how quickly certain commentators pivot whenever Harry's version of events comes back into focus. Rather than engaging with what he actually said, they immediately steer the audience toward reconciliation. Surely enough time has passed. Life is too short. The king is getting older. The brothers need each other. Again, those are emotionally compelling arguments, but they're also incredibly convenient because they bypass the uncomfortable question of whether the underlying issues have ever been addressed. Healing is a beautiful thing. Forgiveness is powerful. But forgiveness and accountability are not enemies. In fact, genuine healing usually requires honesty first. You can't repair trust by pretending trust was never broken. And I think that's what many people miss. When Harry published Spare, he fundamentally changed the royal conversation. For decades, royal disputes were whispered about through anonymous palace briefings, unnamed sources, and carefully managed leaks. Harry disrupted that system. Instead of allowing other people to define his story, he decided to tell it himself. Whether people applauded that decision or criticized it, one thing became impossible to deny. The public finally heard his perspective directly. That's significant because for years critics insisted Harry should explain himself. Then, when he finally did, many of those same voices argued he should have stayed silent. It's an interesting contradiction, isn't it? First, they said he wasn't telling the truth. Then they said he was saying too much. And now, increasingly, it feels as though they're hoping people simply forget what he said altogether. That's why I don't believe the current media conversation is really about reconciliation. I think it's about memory. Public memory is surprisingly fragile. If a narrative is repeated often enough, people stop asking difficult questions. They begin accepting simplified versions of complicated stories. They remember the headlines but forget the timeline. And once that happens, perceptions change. The individual who once spoke out becomes the obstacle. The person who raised concerns becomes the one accused of preventing peace. That's an extraordinary transformation if you think about it. Because without disproving the original concerns, the narrative quietly shifts toward asking why the person who raised them hasn't simply moved on. That isn't accountability, and every time he does, something interesting happens. The conversation immediately shifts away from what he's actually there to do and back toward palace dynamics. It becomes less about his work and more about his relationship with his brother. Less about his purpose and more about palace politics. It's almost as though the institution itself can never quite move beyond the narrative it helped create. And that's why I believe we need to pay attention not only to what's being said, but also to what's being left unsaid. One of the things that stood out to me in the recent commentary was the suggestion that nobody really knows why this rift continues. Really? After everything that has been written, spoken, documented and debated over the past several years, are we seriously expected to believe this is some great unsolved mystery? I don't think so. Whether someone agrees with Harry or disagrees with him is their choice. Reasonable people can look at the same events and reach different conclusions. But pretending Harry never explained his reasons is something entirely different. That's not disagreement, that's selective memory. And selective memory is incredibly powerful. Because if people forget the sequence of events, they also forget how public opinion was shaped. They forget years of relentless headlines. They forget the anonymous briefings. They forget the constant speculation. They forget that long before Harry ever published Spare, he had been speaking about media intrusion, the pressures of royal life, and his concerns about how he and Meghan were being portrayed. Instead, the story becomes much simpler. Two brothers had a falling out. It's neat, it's tidy, It's emotionally satisfying. But life is rarely that simple. Relationships don't fracture overnight, especially relationships built over decades. Trust isn't destroyed by one disagreement, and it's certainly not rebuilt because the public thinks enough time has passed. That's another thing I think gets overlooked. Time doesn't heal everything. Understanding heals, honesty heals, taking responsibility heals. Without those things, time simply creates distance. And perhaps that's why the conversation about reconciliation feels so incomplete. People speak about reconciliation as though it's a calendar event, as though one day everyone simply wakes up, shakes hands, smiles for the cameras, and everything is magically fixed. Real life doesn't work like that. Trust has to be rebuilt. Respect has to be rebuilt. And perhaps most importantly, people have to feel heard. Now, none of us were inside those private conversations. None of us know every detail of what happened behind closed doors, and it would be irresponsible to claim otherwise. We only know what has been shared publicly by the people involved and what has been reported over the years. That's why I think it's important to separate established facts from interpretation. But here's what we do know. Harry chose to tell his story in his own words. Millions of people around the world read it. Some believed him, some questioned him, some rejected his account altogether. That's perfectly normal in any public debate. What isn't normal is pretending those explanations were never offered in the first place. Because once we start erasing uncomfortable chapters, we stop learning from them. And that's why I keep coming back to this idea of narrative. Who controls the narrative? Who decides which parts of history deserve attention and which parts quietly fade away? Every institution understands the power of storytelling. Every public figure understands that perception matters. The royal family is no exception. Image has always been central to the monarchy. That's not criticism. It's simply the reality of being one of the most visible institutions in the world. But image and truth aren't always the same thing. Sometimes they overlap beautifully. Sometimes they don't. And that's why Harry's decision to speak publicly had such an enormous impact. Whether people supported it or opposed it, he took control of a story that had been told about him for years by other people. That changed everything. Because once someone tells their own story, it becomes much harder to pretend they never had one. Perhaps that's why we're now seeing a subtle shift in the conversation. Instead of challenging Harry's account point by point, some commentators seem more interested in moving beyond it altogether. Let's stop looking backward. Let's focus on the future. Or let's hope they reconcile. Again, those sound like positive sentiments. But moving forward doesn't require forgetting the past. In fact, moving forward responsibly often requires remembering it accurately. Otherwise, reconciliation becomes little more than public relations. And that's where I think many people in the audience are far more perceptive than they're often given credit for. People aren't just listening to what's being said, they're noticing what's missing. They're noticing when certain questions suddenly disappear from public discussion. They're noticing when familiar voices who once debated every detail now prefer broad conversations about healing without revisiting the issues that made healing necessary in the first place. That's not accidental. That's how public narratives evolve, not through one dramatic announcement, but through hundreds of small shifts in language, framing, and emphasis. Before long, today's headlines become tomorrow's accepted history. Which is why I think Harry's story continues to resonate with so many people around the world. For some, it's about family. For others, it's about mental health. For many, it's about standing up for your spouse. For others still, it's about challenging institutions that seem too powerful to question. People see different things because the story touches on universal experiences: loyalty, identity, trust, betrayal, forgiveness, and resilience. That's why it refuses to disappear. And perhaps that's also why the conversation keeps returning to Harry. Not because he can't move on, but because his story continues to challenge comfortable assumptions. So when I hear commentators asking what this relationship will look like 10 or 20 years from now, I find myself asking a different question. Will we still remember how we got here? Or will history be edited until future generations believe this was simply a disagreement between two brothers who inexplicably stopped speaking? Because those are two very different versions of the same story. One asks us to think critically, the other asks us to forget. And that's why I believe this conversation matters far beyond the walls of any palace. It's about memory. It's about accountability. It's about who gets to define history. As always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think the public conversation has genuinely shifted away from asking why this rift happened? Or do you think the media is simply reflecting what audiences want to hear? Share your perspective in the comments below, because these discussions are always richer when we hear different viewpoints. If you enjoyed today's analysis, don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you're new to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next discussion. Thank you so much for watching Sussex Gang, and I'll see you in the next one. That's narrative management. And perhaps that's why Harry's recent visit generated so much commentary. Not because anything dramatic happened during the visit itself, but because every appearance Harry makes reminds people that this story isn't finished. Every public engagement reminds audiences that Harry has continued building a life focused on Invictus, charitable work, and international initiatives despite years of criticism. And that reality complicates a narrative that once insisted he would disappear into irrelevance after leaving royal duties. It didn't happen. Instead, Harry continues showing up. And every time he does, the conversation starts all over again.